Rick Harrison, a name known all over the world, has always been a symbol of success, hard work, and determination. People everywhere recognize his face from the famous TV show Pawn Stars. Over the years, Rick became not just a businessman but a trusted figure in the world of entertainment. He showed how smart deals, life lessons, and family values could all come together to create something amazing. Fans loved his humor, his no-nonsense attitude, and his ability to stay strong through anything life threw at him. No one ever thought anything could break Rick Harrison. No one ever imagined that a man who built such a powerful life could find himself standing in a courtroom facing the most terrifying words anyone can hear. Death sentence. When the news first broke, people did not believe it. It seemed impossible, almost like a bad joke. How could Rick Harrison, the tough and clever man everyone admired, be standing on the edge of losing everything, even his life? Some fans cried, others went straight to the internet to find answers. They needed to know the truth. How did Rick end up here? What could have gone so terribly wrong that the court decided to give him the most serious punishment of all? The questions kept growing, and no one could find peace until they knew what had really happened behind those courtroom doors. It all seemed so sudden. Just days ago, Rick was seen smiling, talking to fans, working in his famous pawn shop, and living the life many dream about. Nothing about his public life showed signs of trouble. That made the news even harder to accept. It made people wonder if something deep and hidden had been going on for a long time. Something Rick had kept away from the cameras, something so big that even his fame and money could not protect him from it. The shock of the situation made everyone remember Rick's long journey. He had never been handed an easy life. As a young man, Rick struggled with health problems and financial issues. He worked his way up from almost nothing. He did not become rich overnight. His story was one of patience, struggle, and smart moves. Many people respected him for that. Rick was the proof that with enough grit and brains you could beat the odds. That is why hearing that he might lose it all felt personal to so many fans. They had grown up watching him, learning from him, laughing with him. Now they felt like they were losing a part of their own history. As the courtroom filled with whispers and worried faces, Rick stood strong just like he always did. But even the strongest man cannot fight the law alone. The court had information, something serious enough to change everything. Reporters were scrambling to get any detail they could. Cameras flashed. Everyone wanted to be the first to tell the world what the court had found, but for a few long hours the details stayed hidden. That silence made the fear even worse. What could be so bad that it would lead to a death sentence for a man like Rick? Some people guessed maybe it was an old business deal gone wrong. Others wondered if it was something personal, a secret that had been buried for years. The truth, they said, would shock even the people who thought they knew Rick best. Friends and family were seen entering and leaving the court with sad faces. It was clear that something huge had happened, something that might change the way the world saw Rick Harrison forever. Even after hearing the words death sentence, many fans refused to believe Rick was guilty of anything truly evil. They remembered all the times he had helped people on his show. They remembered his loyalty to his family, his honest talks about life's hard lessons, and the pride he always showed in his work. They asked themselves, how could a man like that end up here? It did not add up. The mystery only deepened. Everyone had their own theory. Some thought he had been set up. Some believed there must be some terrible misunderstanding. Others feared the worst, thinking maybe Rick had been hiding a dark side that no one had seen before. But no matter what anyone believed, one thing was clear. The Rick Harrison they knew, the Rick Harrison they trusted, was now caught in something bigger than himself. And until the court revealed the full truth, the world could only wait and hope for answers. Outside the courtroom, people gathered, holding signs of support. Some cried openly. They said Rick had taught them important lessons about life, money, and never giving up. They said Rick had been like a teacher, a friend, even though they had never met him in person. The sadness in the air was heavy, almost too much to bear. Everyone kept asking the same questions. Was this really happening? Could Rick Harrison, the strong, smart, and tough man they had all cheered for, really be facing the end? What was the real story behind this shocking death sentence? And more importantly, would the truth be something that could save his legacy, or would it leave a mark that could never be erased? As the court prepared to make the next announcement, the tension grew. Cameras kept rolling. Reporters kept talking. Fans kept praying. In just a few moments, the world would hear what really happened. But until that moment came, all anyone could feel was a deep, aching fear of what the truth might be. Rick Harrison's life has been one of hard work, perseverance, and building something from scratch. For many people, his name was connected to the famous show Pawn Stars, a show that brought millions of people into the world of rare artifacts, valuable antiques, and incredible stories. Rick, the star of the show, became a symbol of American success. But long before the TV cameras rolled, Rick's life was filled with challenges and obstacles that most people never saw. His journey was not an easy one, and it wasn't always filled with fame or fortune. Yet it was this very journey that made him who he was and earned him the respect of people all over the world. Rick's story began long before his name appeared on the front of every newspaper. Growing up, life wasn't easy for him. He faced many obstacles in his early years, from health issues to the difficulties of being in a family with limited resources. From a young age, he learned the value of hard work and the importance of never giving up. Rick was determined to make something of himself, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him. His story wasn't about being handed success or having things come easy, it was about fighting every day to reach a goal, no matter how hard it seemed. And he did it. When Rick started his pawn shop in Las Vegas, it was far from glamorous. He didn't have the fancy stores or the worldwide fame he would later enjoy. He started with a small, humble shop and worked his way up, one deal at a time. Over the years, the shop grew, and so did his reputation. People began to trust Rick because of his honesty, his knowledge, and his ability to know the true value of things. He wasn't just another businessman looking to make money, he genuinely loved the world of antiques and rare items. Rick's passion for history, his fascination with unique objects, and his dedication to his work made him stand out from others in the same field. He had a natural ability to recognize what was valuable and what wasn't, and that set him apart. What made Rick even more special to his fans was his down-to-earth personality. He wasn't some rich businessman who sat in an office all day. He was the guy you could imagine sitting at the table with, having a laugh and telling stories. People loved his humor, his sharp wit, and his no-nonsense attitude. But what they didn't always see was the side of Rick that struggled to keep everything together. Behind that tough exterior was a man who worked tirelessly to build a legacy. His journey wasn't about just making money, it was about making a difference, about building something that would last. As Pawn Stars grew in popularity, Rick became a household name. The show took off, and suddenly Rick wasn't just a local businessman in Las Vegas, he was a star. People from all over the world tuned in to watch him negotiate, haggle, and share his knowledge with customers. He became the face of the show, and with that came more responsibility. But Rick handled it all with grace, always remembering his roots and where he came from. He never let the fame change him. He remained true to himself and to the people who supported him from the beginning. Throughout the years, Rick's reputation continued to grow. He became known not just for his ability to run a successful pawn shop but for his sense of loyalty to his family and friends. His son Corey, who worked alongside him at the shop, became a star in his own right. The relationship between Rick and Corey was one of respect and love. It wasn't just a family business, it was a family that cared for each other, that supported each other through thick and thin. And that was something fans loved to see. They could relate to the father-son dynamic and the way Rick always looked out for his family. Rick was also known for his fairness. He wasn't the kind of person who would rip someone off to make a quick buck. He believed in treating people with respect and giving them a fair deal. This was a rare quality in the business world, especially in the world of pawnbroking, where many people think they're being taken advantage of. But Rick changed that perception. He made a name for himself by being honest and transparent with his customers. That's why people trusted him. They knew they could count on him to give them a fair price, no matter what. Fans of the show admired Rick not only for his business skills but for his values. He wasn't just selling objects, he was telling stories. Every item that came through the door had its own history, and Rick knew how to bring that history to life. People loved hearing about the items' pasts, where they came from, and how they ended up in the shop. Rick had a unique ability to connect with people through the items they brought in. He understood that behind every object was a person's memories, struggles, and dreams. And it was this understanding that made Rick not just a businessman but a storyteller. But Rick's life wasn't always smooth sailing. Behind the cameras, he faced his own personal battles. He dealt with health issues that affected him physically and mentally. He went through financial ups and downs, as every businessman does. There were times when things didn't go as planned, and Rick had to fight to keep his business afloat. But through it all, he never gave up. He kept going, knowing that success was never guaranteed, but hard work and perseverance would get him closer to his goals. The love and respect that Rick had earned over the years were not just from fans but from his peers as well. In the world of business, people knew that Rick was someone you could trust. He had built something from nothing, and his success was a testament to his character. But even with all his success, Rick remained humble. He never let his fame go to his head. He continued to work hard, to be there for his family, and to make sure that his business was running smoothly. He was a true example of the American dream. Yet, despite all of his achievements, Rick's life was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. His life, which had been filled with highs and lows, was now facing its biggest challenge yet. The man who had built so much, who had inspired so many, was now standing at a crossroads. And the question everyone was asking was, how did it all go wrong? What happened to the Rick Harrison they knew? What led to the shocking moment when the court sentenced him to death? As the world waited for the truth, people couldn't help but wonder if they had missed something along the way, something that could explain how a man like Rick Harrison could end up in such a dark place.
Rick Harrison had always been known for his strength, resilience, and ability to navigate even the toughest situations. His reputation as a businessman was unshakable, and his success story seemed like one that would continue forever. He had built an empire, one that was admired by millions of people all around the world. For years he had been the face of Pawn Stars, the show that showcased his sharp mind and the way he handled the ups and downs of the pawn business. Everyone knew Rick as the guy who could haggle with anyone, who could find hidden treasures in the most unexpected places, and who could turn a bad deal into a good one with just a few words. But behind all of his success, something had started to change. It was subtle at first, like a small crack in a wall that no one noticed until it grew larger. The cracks in Rick's life had been there for a while, but no one, not even his closest friends and family, saw how deep they ran. It wasn't about his business, it was something much more personal, something that had been building up in the background out of the public eye. The pressure, the stress, and the secrets Rick had kept hidden were starting to weigh heavily on him. It was only a matter of time before they came to the surface. At first, no one noticed the changes. Rick still appeared on TV, still made appearances, still seemed like the same strong, confident man who had made millions through hard work. But behind closed doors, things were different. There were reports that Rick had been struggling with his health, dealing with physical pain that had become harder to ignore. His health issues weren't something he had talked about openly, but those close to him knew that it was a daily battle. What many people didn't know was how much this was affecting him, not just physically but emotionally as well. Rick had always been someone who prided himself on being strong, but even the strongest people can only take so much before they start to break. In addition to his health problems, Rick's personal life began to show signs of strain. His relationships with the people he loved started to suffer. His son Corey, who had worked alongside him for years, seemed to be feeling the pressure too. Their once close relationship began to show cracks, and whispers began to spread that things weren't as perfect behind the scenes as they appeared on TV. Family issues, financial struggles, and the pressure of maintaining the success of the business were taking a toll on Rick. And as much as he tried to keep everything together, it was becoming increasingly difficult. The public still saw Rick as the confident, successful businessman they had always known, but behind the scenes it was a different story. As time passed, the pressure of maintaining this image became too much for Rick to bear. His once strong mental state began to waver, and it was clear that he was no longer the man he once was. His focus shifted from growing the business to simply surviving the challenges that life had thrown at him. He had always been a fighter, but now he was struggling to keep his head above water. It was around this time that things took an unexpected turn. Rumors started to circulate that Rick had become involved in something dangerous, something that could cost him everything he had worked for. People who knew Rick started to whisper about his growing involvement in shady deals that didn't seem to match the man they had always known. The same man who had built his empire on honesty and fair dealings was now rumored to be involved in things that were far from ethical. Those whispers started to grow louder, and soon the public couldn't ignore the rumors any longer. What had happened to Rick? How had he gone from being a symbol of success to someone caught in a scandal that could destroy everything? For those who had watched Rick for years, it was hard to believe. How could the man who had always been so careful, so smart, and so determined end up in such a mess? The change was almost impossible to understand. It didn't seem to fit the image of Rick that people had built in their minds. How had it all gone so wrong? The questions started to mount. What was the real reason behind this sudden shift? What had caused Rick to make decisions that were so out of character? Was it stress? Was it personal problems? Or was it something even darker, something that no one could have predicted? As the rumors continued to spread, the pressure on Rick became unbearable. He tried to keep up appearances, trying to convince everyone that nothing had changed. But deep down he knew that things were falling apart. The weight of the lies, the pressure to keep up the facade, and the fear of losing everything were beginning to crush him. He couldn't keep pretending anymore. The world was starting to see the cracks in his armor, and there was nothing he could do to hide them. His once strong reputation was beginning to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The tipping point came when the authorities started to get involved. Up until this point, the rumors had only been whispers. But when the law got involved, everything changed. Investigations were launched, and suddenly, Rick found himself caught in a web of legal troubles that he couldn't escape. The rumors that had been swirling around for months now had the power of the law behind them. And as the investigations continued, it became clear that Rick was in much deeper trouble than anyone had realized. The once great businessman was now facing the reality of his own mistakes. The news hit like a bombshell. No one saw it coming. Rick Harrison, the man who had built an empire, the man who had been a symbol of success for so many people, was now facing the most serious legal consequences of his life. The public was shocked, and fans were left reeling. How could this happen to someone they had admired for so long? How had the man who had seemed so invincible fallen so far? As the details of the investigation started to come to light, the world began to realize just how serious the situation was. Rick wasn't just facing a few bad deals or minor mistakes, he was facing criminal charges that could cost him everything. The fall from grace was swift, and it seemed like there was no way out. The man who had once been a symbol of success was now a symbol of failure, and the world was watching as his downfall unfolded in front of their eyes. No one could have predicted that Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars, would end up in such a dark place. The shock of it all left people stunned. How had everything gone so wrong? What was the truth behind the rumors, and how had Rick ended up here? As the investigation continued and the legal battles began, the world was left with one burning question: what had really happened to Rick Harrison? The tension had been building for weeks, and now the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. The courtroom was packed, reporters filled the front rows, and the audience waited in complete silence. This was the moment that would reveal the truth. What had really happened to Rick Harrison? How had he gone from being a well-respected businessman to standing in front of a judge, facing a potential death sentence? The air was thick with suspense, and the world was watching. As the doors to the courtroom opened, all eyes turned to Rick Harrison. He walked in, his face a mix of emotions. He had always been a confident man, someone who could face any challenge head-on, but this was different. This wasn't just another business deal or a tough negotiation. This was his life on the line, and the weight of the situation was heavy. He knew that everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was now at risk. The once invincible businessman was now a man fighting for his very existence. As Rick took his seat, the courtroom fell silent. The judge, a stern figure, glanced down at the paperwork in front of him, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. The moment had come, the moment when the truth would be revealed. Everyone in that room knew that what was about to be said would change everything. The question was, what was the truth? Was Rick really guilty of the crimes he had been accused of, or was this all just a misunderstanding? A mistake that had spiraled out of control. The judge cleared his throat, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Every person in that room was holding their breath, waiting for the first words to come from his mouth. And then the judge spoke. He began by acknowledging the severity of the case, how it had shocked the public, how it had shaken the very foundation of Rick Harrison's once stellar reputation. The courtroom hung on every word. People were desperate for answers. What had happened to the man who had been such a fixture in their lives? The judge then began to outline the details of the case. He spoke about the investigations, the evidence that had been gathered, and the mounting pressure from the public. As he spoke, it became clear that Rick's situation was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The crimes he was accused of were serious, and the consequences of those crimes were even more severe. It wasn't just about bad business deals or poor choices. This was something much bigger, something that went beyond what anyone had imagined. The court revealed that Rick's involvement in illegal activities had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. It wasn't just a few bad investments or a few shady deals. It turned out that Rick had been involved in a complex network of criminal activity that spanned years. The evidence was damning, and the charges were serious. For a man who had spent his life building a reputation on fairness and honesty, this revelation was shocking. How could someone who had seemed so upstanding, so trustworthy, be involved in such a dark world? As the details of the case were laid out, the courtroom gasped in disbelief. The once admired businessman was now at the center of a massive scandal, and the public was reeling from the news. How had it come to this? How had Rick Harrison, a man who had seemed like an open book, become so entangled in a web of lies and deceit? The questions flooded the minds of everyone watching. The more they learned, the more they wondered what had led Rick to make the decisions he had. What had driven him to get involved in activities that went against everything he had stood for? The most shocking revelation came when the judge mentioned the death sentence. It was a moment that took everyone by surprise. No one had expected this. It wasn't just the charges that had shocked the public. It was the fact that the court had decided to hand down such a severe punishment. A death sentence for a man like Rick Harrison, it seemed impossible. How could it be that the man who had built such a successful life, who had been a symbol of hard work and determination, was now facing the ultimate punishment? The shock and disbelief in the courtroom were palpable. As the judge continued to speak, the weight of the decision began to sink in. The death sentence wasn't just a punishment for the crimes Rick had committed. It was a symbol of how far he had fallen, of how much his life had changed in such a short period of time. The man who had once been a hero to many was now the villain in a story that no one had ever expected. The contrast between his rise to fame and his sudden fall from grace was almost too much to comprehend. How could the world's most successful pawnshop owner, the man who had earned respect from people everywhere, end up here, facing the end of his life? Rick's face remained stoic as the judge read the final sentence, but inside, everything was crumbling. He had worked so hard to build his life, to create something that would last. He had fought through every challenge, every setback, every obstacle. And now, it seemed like it was all slipping away. The death sentence wasn't just the end of his life, it was the end of everything he had worked for. The empire he had built, the legacy he had created, the love and admiration of his fans, all of it was gone in an instant. The room was filled with whispers. As people tried to process the news, reporters scrambled to get the latest details. Fans sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just heard. The world had changed in a moment, and the future seemed uncertain. How could someone who had seemed so unstoppable end up facing the most final of consequences? As the courtroom cleared, the reporters rushed to the front to get comments from anyone they could. Everyone wanted to know what had led to this shocking decision. How had Rick's life gone so wrong? What was the truth behind the accusations? And most importantly, what did the future hold for Rick Harrison now that his life was on the line? The suspense was unbearable, and the world was left with more questions than answers. The truth had been revealed, but it only raised more questions.
The world was in shock. Rick Harrison, the man who had once been the face of success and resilience, was now facing the greatest challenge of his life. The court's decision had left everyone stunned, but it was only the beginning of the next chapter in Rick's story. With the death sentence hanging over his head, Rick found himself in a battle that was much bigger than anything he had ever faced before. It wasn't just about saving his life, it was about trying to regain the respect he had lost, about finding a way to rebuild what had been shattered, and about understanding how everything had gone so horribly wrong. As Rick sat in the quiet of his cell, he couldn't help but think back to the life he had once lived. He had been a man of ambition, someone who had always believed that hard work and dedication would lead to success. He had built something from nothing, and he had done it with pride. But now, everything seemed like a distant memory. The empire he had worked so hard to create was slipping through his fingers, and he had no idea how to hold on. He had always been able to solve problems, to fix things, but this time it felt different. This time he wasn't sure there was any way out. Rick knew that the path ahead wasn't going to be easy. The court's decision had shaken him to his core, but it wasn't just the fear of death that haunted him. It was the realization that he had lost the trust of everyone who had once admired him. The people who had looked up to him, who had seen him as a symbol of success, were now questioning everything they had believed about him. His reputation was in tatters, and no amount of hard work or effort seemed like it would be enough to fix it. The days in prison felt endless. Each morning Rick woke up with the heavy weight of his sentence pressing down on him. He had always been someone who had controlled his destiny, who had made decisions with confidence, but now he felt like a pawn in a much larger game. He wasn't sure how to navigate this new reality, how to find a way out of the darkness that seemed to surround him. Every time he thought about the past, about the mistakes he had made, a wave of guilt washed over him. How had he let it all slip away? What had gone wrong? As the days turned into weeks, Rick began to realize something important. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for his soul. The shame of what had happened, the guilt of the mistakes he had made, were eating away at him. He had always been proud of the life he had built, but now that pride felt like a distant memory.
The man he had been was gone, and the man he was becoming wasn't someone he recognized. How could he possibly face the world again, knowing that he had let so many people down? The media frenzy continued to rage outside the prison walls. Reporters and journalists camped outside, eager to get the next big story. Everyone wanted to know more about Rick's downfall, to understand how someone who had once been so successful could end up in such a dire situation. The stories were everywhere, each one more dramatic than the last, but in the midst of the chaos, Rick's only focus was on survival. He needed to survive this, not just physically, but emotionally. He needed to find a way to come to terms with what had happened, and find some form of redemption, even if it seemed impossible. His family, once his greatest source of strength, had become distant. Corey, his son, was devastated by the turn of events. The father-son bond they had shared was now strained. Corey was angry, hurt, and confused. He couldn't understand how his father, the man who had raised him and taught him everything he knew, had ended up in this situation. The family that had once been so close was now fractured, each member dealing with the fallout in their own way. Rick had always been the one who held things together, the one who everyone could rely on, but now it felt like everything was falling apart. He couldn't help but wonder if the damage was too great to repair. Was it too late to fix the broken relationships, to rebuild the trust that had been lost? Outside of prison, people were divided. Some still held on to the belief that Rick had been wronged, that he was the victim of circumstances beyond his control. They believed that he had made mistakes, but they didn't think he deserved to die for them. Others, however, felt betrayed. They couldn't understand how the man they had once admired could have fallen so far. Rick's name had become synonymous with scandal and deceit, and the public's view of him had completely shifted. The people who had once cheered for him, who had watched him negotiate deals on TV and marveled at his expertise, now felt betrayed by his actions. Could he ever regain their trust? Was there a way to prove that he was still the man they once admired? As the months passed, Rick started to work through his feelings. He spent hours thinking about the choices he had made, the things he had done wrong, and the way he had let everything slip through his fingers. He knew that he couldn't change the past, but he also knew that he could learn from it. There was still a chance for him to find redemption, but it wouldn't come easily. He would have to prove to himself, and to the world, that he was capable of change. He would have to face the consequences of his actions, accept responsibility for what he had done, and try to make things right. One day, as Rick sat alone in his cell, he made a decision. He was done running from his mistakes. He was done hiding behind the walls of guilt and shame. If there was a way out of this, it wouldn't be through denial or trying to avoid the truth. It would be through facing the reality of what he had done, and trying to rebuild from there. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but Rick was determined to start the process of healing, both for himself and for those he had hurt. In the weeks that followed, Rick began to take small steps toward redemption. He reached out to his family, to Corey, and tried to begin the difficult process of rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't easy. There were a lot of hard conversations, a lot of pain, and a lot of tears. But slowly, Rick started to see signs of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for him. Maybe there was a way to make things right, to show the world that he was more than just the mistakes he had made. But the question remained, could Rick truly redeem himself in the eyes of the public, or would he forever be defined by the fall from grace that had taken everything from him? As Rick struggled with his past, the world continued to watch, eager to see if there was any hope for the man who had once been on top of the world. Could he rise again, or would he be lost forever to the shadows of his past? Rick Harrison had spent so much of his life building a reputation that he could be proud of. He had worked tirelessly to create a business empire, one that millions of people respected and admired. His life had once seemed like the perfect example of what hard work and determination could achieve. But now, as he sat in his prison cell, Rick wondered if it was all for nothing. The life he had worked so hard to build had crumbled, and with it so had his sense of self-worth. Every day felt like a struggle, not just to survive, but to find a way to rise above the mess he had created. The question that haunted him every waking moment was simple but painful. Was it too late for him to make things right? Could he ever regain the trust of his family, his friends, and the millions of people who had once looked up to him? Or had he lost everything for good? It wasn't just about his own redemption anymore. It was about proving that he could be more than the mistakes he had made. Rick knew that if he was ever going to move forward, he would have to face his past head-on. He couldn't run from it anymore. The weight of the guilt and shame was suffocating, but Rick understood that he had to take responsibility for what he had done. He couldn't change the past, but he could start working towards a better future. The road to redemption wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't as simple as saying sorry and expecting everything to go back to normal. Rick had done things that had hurt people, his family, his fans, and even the people who had trusted him with their money. He had betrayed that trust, and the consequences were severe. The court's decision had shown just how high the stakes were. But Rick wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't give up. He spent long hours in his cell, thinking about his past actions and how they had led him to this point. He thought about the decisions he had made, the risks he had taken, and the people he had hurt along the way. Every choice seemed to have led him down a darker path. But now Rick was determined to change. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was his chance, not just to survive, but to prove to the world that he wasn't the same man who had fallen from grace. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing that he was capable of learning from his mistakes and doing better. Rick knew that his family was the key to his redemption. They were the ones who had been the closest to him, who had seen the good and the bad. They had stood by him when things were tough, but now they were angry, hurt, and disappointed. His relationship with his son Corey had suffered the most. Corey had been devastated by Rick's actions, and understandably so. The trust between them had been shattered, and it seemed impossible to repair. But Rick couldn't give up on that. He couldn't give up on his son. He had to try to make things right, even if it seemed like the damage was too great to fix. It wasn't just Corey, who Rick needed to make amends with. There were so many people who had looked up to him, who had admired his success, and believed in him. Rick had always been a role model, someone who people thought they could trust. Now he was a symbol of failure and betrayal. Could he ever get back the respect he had lost? Could he ever rebuild the reputation that had taken him so many years to create? The hardest part of it all was that no one could answer those questions. Rick didn't know if it was even possible. The public's perception of him had changed completely. He wasn't the man people had thought he was, and now they saw him as a criminal, a man who had let them down. He had to prove that he wasn't defined by his mistakes, that he could rise above them and make things right. But where would he even begin? One thing Rick did know for sure was that he couldn't do it alone. He needed the help of the people he had hurt. He needed Corey, he needed his family, he needed the people who had once believed in him. Without their support, he couldn't make it. It was a hard truth to face, especially when he didn't know if they would ever forgive him. But it was the truth. Redemption wasn't something he could earn on his own. It was something that had to come from the people he had wronged. Rick decided to reach out. He began writing letters to Corey, to his family, to the people who had once trusted him. He poured his heart into each letter, expressing his remorse, his shame, and his determination to change. He apologized for the mistakes he had made, for the ways he had hurt them, and for the pain he had caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew that he didn't deserve it. But he did ask for a chance to prove that he was capable of being better. Days turned into weeks, and Rick waited. He didn't know if his letters would make a difference. He didn't know if his family would even read them. But he couldn't just sit in silence and do nothing. He had to try, he had to take action, even if it felt like there was no hope. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. Corey came to visit. Rick had been waiting for this moment, but he didn't know how to prepare for it. When Corey walked into the room, Rick could see the anger and hurt in his eyes. It was clear that their relationship had been broken, but Rick wasn't ready to give up on it. He had made mistakes, and he had to own up to them. Corey sat down across from him, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with years of unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Finally, Corey broke the silence. He told Rick how much he had been hurt by what had happened, how he had felt betrayed by his father. He told Rick that it was hard to even look at him, let alone forgive him. Rick listened, his heart breaking as he realized the depth of the damage he had caused. But then Corey did something that Rick hadn't expected. He didn't forgive him right away, but he didn't shut him out either. He told Rick that he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive him, but he was willing to try. That was all Rick needed to hear. That small opening was enough to give him hope. It was the first step toward healing, and Rick knew that it was a chance he couldn't waste. Rick had no illusions about the road ahead. It was going to be long, difficult, and uncertain. But for the first time in months, he felt like there was a way forward. Redemption wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. And as long as he had the chance to try, he wasn't going to give up.